Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Sébastien Soleil. I'm the Global Head of Energy Transition and Environment for BNP Paribas. And I'm very glad to moderate this panel this afternoon. So as you all know, today is the 5th edition of the Climate Finance Day. And actually, financial institutions have been making great progresses regarding dealing with climate for the last few years. For the 6th year in a row, we can show progress and show new actions regarding climate. As you all know, it's much more complex for biodiversity. For biodiversity, we don't have a single indicator such as a ton of equivalent CO2. We don't have a global agreement such as the Paris Agreement that sets a global target. We don't have markets that put clear value, clear economic value on the ton of carbon, such as the European emission trading scheme. So it's really much more difficult. Nonetheless, for a few years already, a lot of financial institutions have already started working on biodiversity. So a few examples. So, for instance, in BNP Paribas, since 2012, we had been integrated criteria related to biodiversity, especially deforestation, in our credit portfolios. Our foundation has been supporting for years already different research projects on biodiversity and climate. In 2018, there was an initiative Act for Nature, launched by EPE, the French Association Business for Environment, under which several French institutions have taken commitments regarding biodiversity. And more financial institutions are engaging in dialogues with their clients in the most material sectors to make sure that these clients take care of biodiversity, take care of the preservation of biodiversity within their activities. And we develop, BNP Paribas, but the other banks as well, we develop more and more specific products. For instance, we have concluded a big SLL, Sustainable Link Loan, with UPM, forest-based financial company, with KPI and target related to the preservation of forests. But Gwendoline, you will say a few words on this later. We engage in several partnerships with organizations and financial institutions all around the world to increase the development of data providing and transparency framework on biodiversity, such as the TNFD, Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So financial institutions, the world of finance, has been doing quite a lot on biodiversity until now. But obviously, it's clearly not enough. And I would like to quote Jean-Laurent Bonnafé, our CEO, who said a few days ago at the beginning of the month at a big biodiversity event in Paris, he said that regarding biodiversity, we were clearly collectively very late, and we have to increase our effort at an exponential rate. So yes, we have to progress much quicker. And that's why we are gathered here with 4 of us physically present and 2 of us in Washington and in Geneva. So we'll try to discuss all these matters and to see how finance can progress quickly enough on biodiversity. So now we'll start the first one of presentation. So I will ask to each of the speakers to present briefly him or herself and her organization. So we'll start with 2 people that are quite far away. So Ivo, can you tell us who you are and who you represent?
Hello, I'm just hearing a background noise. So thanks very much, Sebastian, and thanks to the organizers for the kind invitation.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I work for UNEP, based in Geneva. UNEP is considered to be the environmental authority within the UN system. We're known for setting up conventions such as for climate change, biodiversity, and land degradation. And of course, the scientific bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. We're much less known for partnering with the private sector, but the climate finance unit that I'm leading is seeking to proactively unlock public and private finance for sustainable land use, and I will provide a few examples later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Augustin. So who are you? Who do you present?
Hi, Sebastian. Just checking. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yes, fine.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So I work with Conservation International. We're an international NGO focused on, originally actually focused on biodiversity conservation. We were set up in 1987 and now have a presence in over 30 countries, mostly around the tropics. So within CI, what I do is lead our conservation finance work. So essentially try to figure out how we can work with private sector and public to scale up all of these financing solutions. So happy to share some of these throughout the next hour.
Thank you. So Matthew?
Hi, yeah, I'm Matthew Reed. I'm the head of development for sustainable finance at the EDF Group. For those of you who don't know EDF, we're one of the largest producers of electric energy in the world. Last year we had about 122 gigawatts net installed capacity. We produced just under 570 terawatt hours. We're also very committed in the low carbon transition. In 2019, our CO2 emissions were around 55 grams per kilowatt hour. That's about 8 times less than the industry average, and that's obviously a very important lever for what we're here to talk about today, which is biodiversity. EDF has made a number of commitments related to biodiversity and how we plan to finance that, and my role is to make sure that the group's strategies are also consistent with its financing practices. So I'm looking forward to discussing that with you today.
Gwen?
Lots of logistics and masks to take off. Gwen Yu, I head up engagement transformation at BNP Paribas. So my job there is twofold. I report to Antoine Cyr, who is the equivalent of our Chief Sustainability Officer. And my job within the bank is to first help set up and implement, roll out, set up the strategy for sustainable businesses and sustainable finance across the different groups and businesses that we have. The second hat that I have is the upskilling of our employees so that we have the same sustainability base throughout. The second hat, and why I'm here today, is because I also work as the alternate or Sherpa. I don't really like that word, but that's what it's called. The Sherpa for Antoine Cyr, who's one of the co-chairs for the TNFD, along with Rian-Marie Thomas and Marius Calvert for the informal work group that's just been set up. And then the third hat that I have, which I just started this morning, is also as a Sherpa, again that word, to Helena Svines-Fiestas, who is the rapporteur of the European Commission's Sustainable Finance Platform on Usability. So looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks. Rachel?
Hi, I'm Rachel Colby. I'm Director of Sustainability at InVivo Group. And InVivo is a union of French agricultural cooperatives. And we just became a Société à Mission last week, which means a purpose-based company. And so what we're really concentrating our efforts on is how we can actually drive the transition in agriculture and food with using regenerative practices in order to provide the kinds of solutions that will help make this transition a purely sustainable future and a resilient agro-system. And as a director of CSR, every day we work with the teams and mainly the businesses to be sure that our operations and all of our businesses are bringing a positive impact to the environment, including biodiversity.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks, Rachel. So we'll stay with you, Rachel, for the first question. So obviously, agriculture is directly related to biodiversity. Can you tell us how you try and implement innovative agricultural practices that preserve biodiversity? And to what extent do you manage to finance these innovative solutions?
So clearly people often cite agriculture for all of the harm that it has done to biodiversity. As I just mentioned, what we're really starting to mobilize our forces for is to make agriculture a solution. Clearly, in terms of all of these climate stakes at hand, agriculture has a key role to play. Not only in biodiversity, but also in carbon sequestration, purification of water, and the use of water, and also rural livelihoods in a general sense. And so the way that we're trying to push this forward is really accompanying the different farmers so that they can start having regenerative practices, as I mentioned. And biodiversity is key to that because one of the very main parts of actually having this sustainable agriculture that is an ally for biodiversity is considering the biodiversity within the soils. Oftentimes we hear about soil health, but we don't necessarily think about the importance of having that microfauna and the macrofauna in a dynamic equilibrium within the soils. So that's one of the first things that we're working on is accompanying practices that are going to help be sure of having that. And that also then requires having a positive equilibrium between the carbon that's in the soil and the nitrogen. We need nitrogen in the soil. This is the foodstuffs, actually, for that biodiversity within the soil that makes sure then that the soil is actually going to be productive and fertile. From there, using the kinds of practices like cover crops, intensified crop rotations, there we can also include some of the things that have often been pushed for within the international community, like hedges and flower strips that are going to help the biodiversity, but it's really starting with the soil that's going to make it happen. And so I'm obviously saying all of this too succinctly, don't have enough time to go more into the definitions of that, but what we're doing is that we're bringing the solutions, both the technical itineraries to accompany the farmers within that, and then we're also bringing the digital tools that are capable of tracing that progress, because if we're going to find out how we finance this, we need to have that type of traceability that is really reliable in terms of data to be able to show what is actually being improved upon, how, in what case the biodiversity in the soil has been improved, the biodiversity above the soil has been improved. And with that, that's when we hope to actually have an economic model that is viable, because we hope that that means, point one, we'll be able to value for a better price the productions. We'll also improve productivity and yields, because once we've gotten past the initial hump, we actually can improve the resilience, and so we're safeguarding productivity with a more resilient system. Doing these types of measures, which oftentimes are referred to as regenerative agriculture, they're what's going to help reduce the needs of inputs, so that's savings on the farm. And then we can also hope to monetize some of these environmental services that have been brought about, whether it be sequestering carbon or helping to purify water, stocking water, and improving the overall biodiversity at the farm. And so the first part of financing is having an actual resilient, regenerative economic model on the farm. And then the other side, though, because we know that it takes about 3 to 5 years before we actually have a system that is going to carry forward that type of virtuous circle that I'm describing, we do have a real need for financing. We need to have the right approach from the states and the governments, the European Union for that. And we also are going to need the kind of financing that helps sort of pre-finance the initial investments that the farmer has to take before he or she is actually able to enjoy the type of robust economic model that I was describing.
Thank you. No, Matthew, so EDF business seems more farther away from biodiversity than that of InVivo. So, yes, nonetheless, you have integrated KPIs related to biodiversity in your financing scheme. You have changed your green bond framework, including biodiversity KPIs. Can you explain us what you have done, why, and how?
Yeah. So I think there's kind of two parts to that question. One is, why does EDF care about biodiversity in the first place? And then, what's our strategy and how are we financing it? EDF is a landowner and land manager of really primary importance in a lot of the places it operates. And almost 80% of our land holdings are either in or around sensitive natural areas. So if you take our hydroelectric facilities, for example, 80% of them are near a Natura 2000 site. So it's something that's really quite important to the operations we have. So that's why for 50 years now, EDF has taken significant measures in favor of biodiversity. Starting in the 70s, we created a research facility to study the ecological impact of our hydroelectric generating activities. In 2006, we created our first dedicated biodiversity policy. And then just a few years ago, we actually made biodiversity one of our corporate social responsibility objectives. And we stated that our objective was to actually have a positive impact on biodiversity, not just limit ourselves to avoiding impacts. So that's our commitment. How does that translate in terms of strategy? Sebastian, you mentioned the Act for Nature initiative. EDF has signed up to Act for Nature both in France and internationally. And that involves 20 different commitments that I don't have the time to get into, but it articulates in a concrete way the steps we plan to take. So that's why this year, when we updated our green bond framework, we took the decision to include biodiversity. EDF's been a green bond issuer for since 2013, so going on 8 years. Our first green bond issuance in 2013 was dedicated almost exclusively to renewable energy, but as time's gone on, we've adapted it to our various activities such that this year, when we updated our framework, in light of our strategy and our commitment, it made a lot of sense to include biodiversity. So what does that include? It includes 3 categories of biodiversity projects. Projects that are targeted at reducing the impact of projects in development, so avoiding, reducing, and compensating for impact. The second category is related to renaturing and restoring the sites we already manage, especially our hydroelectric facilities. And the third is funding research and development. For what it's worth, between 2018 and 2021, we've already invested $21 million in research in favor of biodiversity. What does one of these projects look like? I could give you 2 examples. They're both hydroelectric. One is the Gavet project on the Romanche River in southeastern France. There, we, under our old green bond framework, it wasn't even a dedicated category at that point. We were able to use some of the funding from our old green bond to fund a restoration of territory around hydroelectric works involving 5 different facilities. And we worked with a local association to source natural vegetation from a 25-kilometer radius to restore the terrain impacted by the project. And now we manage 57 hectares of property under active management to support biodiversity. Another good example is our CHEMS project in Alsace. There we restored an estuary to its original site, again, in consultation with the local association. And that was a 60 million euro investment. So these are actually significant amounts. And that's why it makes sense for us to include it in our green bond framework. And then the final aspect of it, and why it's interesting to us to have biodiversity in our green bond approach, is there's a requirement then for reporting. This is something that we've talked about a lot for those of us who talk about biodiversity. How do you report on biodiversity? And I think we'll get into this a little bit. There's kind of 2 articulations. There's reporting at the corporate level. For our green bond framework, it really involves project reporting. And so we commit to report on certain indicators depending on the project type, and then also to provide qualitative information, which is, I think, as anyone on this panel will tell you, really important in terms of contextualizing the benefits you're actually bringing through these projects. So that's a little bit about why we took that step and how we're doing it.
Thanks, Matthew. So this bit about reporting provides us a smooth transition for Gwen. So Gwen, it seems that we need more transparency, we need more reliable data to be able to work efficiently on biodiversity. And apparently this is missing in terms of biodiversity. So the TNFD was created very recently to fill this gap. Can you tell us what are the aim of TNFD, and how do you intend to proceed to deliver a framework or anything to this end?
So I think if you've been attending any of the Finance for Tomorrow conferences or any of the biodiversity or natural capital conferences that have been going around, you've heard about the TNFD. And you've all heard the numbers, that's related to positive and negative nature-based transactions or projects, where we hear things like 10.1 billion in annual revenues or more than 400 million jobs that need to be created for nature positive transactions. So the TNFD is really a way to push nature to the forefront of all this and to give it more visibility within the financial systems. Investors can expect corporates, like what Matthew was saying, to have more disclosures on their impact dependencies and risks. And as investors, we're then going to be able to push this information through to our clients. And clients like you and me can then make better decisions in terms of where we want to put our money. And by doing this, it's going to lead to greater demand, the mainstreaming of nature within finance, and hopefully a virtuous competition of sorts that we're currently seeing within energy transition. In general, there's also, well, what we're hoping with TNFD is that it's going to be a normalization of the data usability and disclosures that's available, because as Matthew and Rachel pointed out, there's actually a lot of different segmentations, a lot of different data sources that are there. So I think it's important to note that from a financial point of view, what we're really looking for is a localization of the assets and a layer on top of that in terms of, what are the water loss related, land degradation, any kind of positive, negative externalities that would be there, the quantity of the commodities that are there. So from which plantations, which factories are you getting that from, what are the mines, what are the vessels in terms of the shipping, the traceability of this actual commodity. So we can use technology like blockchain or geolocalization, but as Matthew and Rachel and any of our panelists will be able to tell you, that's going to be very specific in terms of what commodities we're talking about. And more importantly, what is then the environmental impact of all these asset classes within the ecosystem that they exist in? So that's a disparate and wide range of data sources that we're looking at. So the idea behind the TNFD, or one of the ideas behind the TNFD, is not necessarily that there's a lack of data out there, but it's more on the usability of this data and comparability of it for financial institutions. And as just a qualitative example of that is when BNP Paribas Asset Management with AXA, Mirova, and Sycamore asked for a call for data providers on this, they only had 14 responses. So with the TNFD, we're hoping that this will accelerate the provision of data, the emphasis on the actual value of nature so that we're accounting for this when we talk about it from an economic sense, and then therefore we can have the proper capital allocation to all these type of projects. So finance really needs to realize the breadth of the impact of biodiversity loss. I think at this point we're probably in the awareness phase and trying to figure out which methodologies would work out. And it's probably where carbon was, a few years ago. But I think we're getting there. And for TNFD, there's been a lot of preliminary interest. So I think there's over 70 or close to 100 members right now of the informal working group from development institutions, central banks, financial institutions, NGOs. And the informal working group has really been set up to try to figure out what the scope and objectives would be for the TNFD, which is going to kick off next year, and it's going to be a 2-year process. And the TNFD is supported, or the informal work group is supported by the project team with UNEP, UNDP, Global Canopy, and other names that I've forgotten, I'm sure, plus a lot of different financial institutions and a technical expert group that's helping define and map the different methodologies, risk, opportunity measurements that are out there. And just to conclude, I have my notes because it's a large task and I didn't want to forget anything, but it's also absolutely necessary because we want to have the framework. Because by having this framework, we're then able to drive and scale finance towards the preservation of nature and hopefully close this funding gap that we all hear about.
Thank you, Gwen. So now a question for you, Augustin. Conservation International has been financing biodiversity-related projects for many years already. So how does it work? With whom do you collaborate? And Do you see an increase in the financing of preservation of biodiversity? Know that many organizations say that it's so important to preserve biodiversity. Have you witnessed a change recently or not? So up to you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Sebastian. And let me start with the last one. And have we seen an increase? Yes, I would say. Is it enough? No, not even close, right? So when the Paulson report came out recently saying there's a $500 billion gap to meet our biodiversity goals, it means that whatever uptick we've had since the last decade, it's probably 5x the amount of biodiversity funding that has increased. It's still very, very small, kind of in the big picture. And that includes everything that we're doing. So, we've invested approximately 500 million in biodiversity conservation over the last, probably 6 years or so, and in lots of kind of different ways, and I'll explain some of them. But that's not to confuse sort of what we need and how far we are from that goal. And I think that's something we need to learn from climate, where we've sort of confused action or really activity for impact, where we see the amount of green finance increasing exponentially, and yet CO2 emissions increase as well, right? So we really need to focus on impact here, and not only no net negative, really biodiversity positive impact, and that's sort of the focus of our work, is really focusing on that sort of investment. So we typically work with the sort of 4 big stakeholders: civil society, governments, private sector, meaning kind of non-government, and communities. And that's because that's who, one way or another, is responsible for biodiversity. And these are the folks that live around it, that manage it, that can destroy it. So I think we need to figure out effective ways of dealing with those. We're not. People talk about investing in biodiversity. Very rarely do you actually invest in sort of the biodiversity itself or help it. Species that they know what to do most of the time. It's the human species that doesn't. So, most of the work is really sort of focused on that side, working with these stakeholders. And there can be big things such as protected areas. So we have a big track record of setting up, working with all these stakeholders, set up protected areas of all different types. If you add it up, it's about 100 million hectares that we've protected over the last 20 years or so, which again is a big number, but it's not nearly enough of sort of what we need. And our primary funding mechanisms for those are public programs such as the Global Environment Facility, CPF, the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, which, by the way, the French government are big supporters of both. And those have a very clear sort of role to play in these ecosystems, these kind of grant-based finance. But we also do non-grant sort of work. We work with a lot of corporates, big names like Apple, Walmart, folks that you would have heard of, and also companies that you wouldn't have heard of. So a small Malagasy producer that is producing, chocolate and cocoa. But we extend financing to them, loan-based financing. And these are sort of biodiversity loans. And the way we sort of, focus on the pro part is to build in incentives. So for this specific producer, the more native species that they interplanted within their plantation, essentially, the less they had to repay us in terms of interest rates. And we saw a marked increase in the amount of lemurs, which were our sort of, KPI, the key species that we were tracking in that ecosystem. We saw a marked increase with science to back it up over the last decade or so. So that's a very kind of micro, kind of project, and, an example of how biodiversity kind of focused financing can work, but they're also scalable. So those initiatives that we had under a fund, it was called the Verde Ventures Fund, we then pushed to the private sector, and it's now a much bigger fund managed by a private asset manager called Finance in Motion out of Frankfurt. They launched the Eco Business Fund. They have about 500 million in loans and growing, sort of all over the world. And I think we need to push more, for that kind of finance. So it's not only do no harm, but again, it's how do you incentivize these positive, biodiversity outcomes. And the final one I'll talk about is carbon. So carbon is a key one, and it's obviously very much a commodity. A ton of CO2 is a ton of CO2 from the atmosphere's perspective. But that's up there. From down here, there's a very real difference in how you generate that ton of CO2. So there's a pro-biodiversity way of solving climate versus a non. And CI and a bunch of other NGOs formed the Climate Community and Biodiversity Alliance, which is now a standard. It's sort of own thing. And it's become the leading voluntary standard for offsetting. So there are ways of sort of pushing the market, and our experience has been that when consumers or even corporates are given the option, they tend to choose the pro-biodiversity option as long and it's a big sort of if it's simple enough and cost effective. So anyway. It's a long way of saying we have a long track record in this. We're by far not the only ones, but it's if you add up everything we've done, we're still a long way from where we need to go, and that's where we need the finance industry and just general kind of mainstreaming of all these principles, which is why it's so exciting, all of the work of the task force and everybody else on the panel. And by the way, since Matthew was talking about renewable energy, one important thing that we need to do is think outside the box as well. We tend to think of protected areas as the only way of protecting biodiversity. But recent kind of research has come out that offshore wind farms are actually a de facto kind of marine protected area, and you can understand why. No ships can get in there, obviously. So they're actually under the water. There's a thriving ecological system, and it's not described as a marine protected area. But that's the the effective result. So it's these kind of win-wins that we really need to find. Over to you.
Thank you, Augustine. So now, Iro, it seems, according to what our panelists just said, that it's quite difficult to finance biodiversity-related projects. So we need to increase much faster. So in your view, what would be the most efficient ways to finance the preservation of biodiversity? Much more massively and much more efficiently. What are your views on this?
Yeah, thanks, Sebastian. And Augustine, I like the example that you just gave. It's something that I hadn't heard about before. Basically, offshore wind being basically breeding ground for biodiversity to recover. To answer your question, Sebastian, I think what is needed is to close this gap, which I think both Augustine and also Gwen already alluded to. The OECD is estimated at around 78 to 90 billion is currently flowing to biodiversity protection, mostly from public budgets. But around 300 to 400 billion is needed. So that would basically give us a gap of 200 to 300 billion. A recently issued report by TNC, Cornell, that basically outlined, and the Paulson Institute outlined a gap of 500 billion. So it's basically a large gap to overcome. So what needs to be done, in my view, is first of all to stop or redirect those flows of capital that currently negatively impact on biodiversity, which is most of mainstream public and private finance to date. And second is to scale up those flows of public and private capital that have a net positive impact on biodiversity. So how to do this? I think what is needed, first of all, is for governments to start and reform fiscal policies, be it in the context of agriculture or other sectors that are, say, sensitive to biodiversity. It is not about stopping agricultural production, but as Rachel indicated, ensure that agriculture can grow in a way that delivers an income for the farmer, but balances that with the need to protect biodiversity and reduce emissions. At the moment, governments are spending more than 500 billion on public capital that negatively impacts biodiversity. So reforming agricultural subsidies and other forms of fiscal incentives that can basically outline where improvements can be made is the first area. A lot of NGOs have called for say, a Green Deal for nature, calling for protection of 30% of terrestrial and marine environment by 2030, and 500 billion a year as a starting point, which is a letter that was submitted to the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. So on the public funding side, it is really, I think, looking at what kind of source of public finance are currently negatively impacting biodiversity, and how can it be reformed in such a way that still benefits the economy and people's livelihoods, but looks also at the biodiversity and climate angle. And then for the financial industry, I think it is to look at the portfolio or level of the balance sheet of where are the types of assets that are negatively impacting biodiversity, and to set basically goals of how to address these step by step. And I think as Gwen outlined, I hope that the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, the TNFD, can help in that regard. And the flip side of reducing negative impact is basically scaling up capital that has a positive impact. I mean, UNEP is partnering with Rabobank, with BNP Paribas, with impact investors like Mirova, and we've helped create funds such as the Agri-Free Fund, an initiative, the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility, and earlier this week we announced a new restoration seed capital facility. All of these are basically funds that can increase the credit quality through longer tenors, by covering part of the risk through first loss guarantees, so that those loans or investments that have a positive impact on people, nature, and climate can basically go ahead, because they're often falling outside what a credit committee or investment committee would find acceptable from a risk-return profile. So I think it is, first of all, reform of agricultural fiscal policies and other forms of fiscal incentives by governments, scaling up, making commitments under the post-2020 biodiversity framework. And on the finance side, it's basically looking from a portfolio level of where changes in the business need to be made, and to set goals year on year to address these, coupled with basically a positive commitment around financing clients and projects that have positive impacts on biodiversity. Thank you. Now, I have a question for all of you, because I think it's quite important, and all of you alluded to it already. The lack of clear and commonly accepted metrics and KPIs for biodiversity seems to be a big challenge. So we don't have the equivalent of the ton of CO2. What do you think is needed, and what do you think already exists? What do you think would need to be created, or mainstream, or whatever? So yes, what is your point on metrics and KPIs? Gwen?
So some of the panelists here already mentioned a bunch of the data, and I alluded to the fact that we have a lot that already exists. So we have, reports that help us understand the dependencies and the impact through organizations like the Natural Capital Protocol, or through UNEP on what Ivo was talking about. And then we also have tools like Encore, Trace, TrueCost, other data providers that already show us what our impact and dependencies are in terms of high risk, high impact sectors at a portfolio level, and also potentially, depending on the commodity, also going down into supply chain management through the entire value chain. And I guess as a wish list, I go back to my data wish list, I can boil it down into like 4 things, right? There's localization, sourcing, traceability, and impact. And we want to be able to tag nature on all these 4 kind of prisms across the entire value chain, because by being able to do that, then we can price it at each point of the value chain. So the data that we have, we need to be able to aggregate, harmonize, contextualize. By doing so, it's going to enable the right financial decisions, because we've then tagged it through the entire value chain. And then this will enable us to do what Ivo was talking about in terms of de-risking and funding the right capital into the right portfolio or projects.
Mathieu?
Yeah, I think there's another point to be made as well that, and this is generally true of sustainable finance, but when you're looking at an indicator, whether it's for biodiversity or any other aspect of sustainability, what's the connection to the company's strategy? So if you're looking at it from a corporate perspective, and Rachel did a great job of outlining this, what it looks like at InVivo, is the indicator linked to something that, commitments that the company's made more generally? How does it fit into its strategies? That's obviously important when it comes to climate, but I think it's also true when it comes to biodiversity. So for example, at EDF, what we've done, we do have a corporate indicator, we have project level indicators on biodiversity, but we also have a corporate level indicator on biodiversity. Previously, that was an indicator related to how well we understood the property we manage, but we're actually going to modify that to link it to our Act for Nature commitments. So there, you're linked to concrete engagements that are through a third party, essentially, and then measuring our progress against that. So I think when we talk about indicators, it's also important to keep in mind the importance of consistency and coherence with overall strategy of issuers and companies generally.
Rachel?
Sure, so if I actually bring it down a notch, because I'm a little bit less global in perspective, is that clearly what I really appreciated by what I've heard so far is that we need to get back to what we're trying to achieve. So clearly having something that's simplified and can be harmonized is very important. But also, maybe in the past we've looked at too many different indicators in terms of what is being put in place, what are the means that are being put in place. And what I think is really important, or the perspective that we're taking, is that we need to be a lot more on impact, which was mentioned. And the impact, it doesn't matter how you're going to get there as long as you get to that impact that we're seeking. So in regenerative agriculture, we're going to look at, for example, how much organic matter is in the soil, because that is the same indicator as how much carbon is being stored there. We're going to look at how much water is being stocked in the soil, because that's going to indicate that, yes, we've regenerated the soils, so in terms of productivity, it's a safe bet. But at the same time, we also know that in terms of climate change, that there will be an actual resilience facing that. So those are the kind of sort of end game goals that we're wanting to use that are then going to chart whether or not we're actually making considerable progress. And I'm going to do it a little tongue-in-cheek, but bien sûr, of course, we're so happy with having this really easy carbon indicator. Well, yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm a little new to this game, and what I've discovered is that, for example, experts tell me that, Rachel, it's a great idea to want to try to produce more proteins in France, because of course we can do, help the livestock. There are regions in France where we can do soy in a regenerative way. There are regions then also that we can do lupin, we can do linseed, we can do alfalfa. There are all sorts of things that are going to make sense from an agroecological perspective, regenerative, because we're going to use those legumineuses that help actually store nitrogen in the soil, so we don't have to add in so many fertilizers, and the soil actually is covered, so the organic life in there is going to be improved, etc. And so I'm looking at this and I'm seeing the exponential of what that represents, and then I'm told, oh, but if you do a life cycle analysis, actually Brazilian soil, GMO Brazilian soil imported into Europe is actually going to have a better footprint than doing soy in France. Let's just never lose sight of what we're actually trying to achieve.
Augustin, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that last point is exactly right. And if this, we shouldn't get too hung up on trying to find the exact indicator, because biodiversity is different than carbon. right? But just by its very nature, there's some biodiversity that's much more important in a local context. And what we don't want, obviously, is to create islands of sort of, you know, sustainability and perfection in a bigger degraded landscape. So we need to think holistically about the whole landscape, you know, the ecoregion where we operate. And for us, you know, habitat basically as a proxy for biodiversity is a very imperfect proxy, but it's you know, sort of good enough, especially when you're talking about these macro levels. So yes, more specificity is needed, especially at the sort of micro level, but I don't think there is a silver bullet, you know, to be had.
Ivo, do you want to add something on KPIs and metrics?
Yeah, no, I like the example that Rachel gave. I think for farmers it does make sense, and I think what you're doing at InVivo is I think is very encouraging and exciting. If I look at the financial industry, I do think that some form of guidance is needed. I think, as Augustine alluded to, renewable energy and energy efficiency is I think by now an established asset class, in many cases an alternative asset class, but nonetheless there are billions of private capital flowing to the space. I do think that we need to sort of box in what we mean by, say, sustainable land use, for example, in a way. On the risk side, this is already being done by the IFC performance standards. They provide clear guidance what kind of negative impact needs to be avoided and how to mitigate these. What has been elusive so far is to identify the positive impact areas. And UNEP actually at the moment is going through a series of 7 workshops over these weeks between mid-October and mid-November to try and converge on a number of KPIs that also define, say, the positive impact that we're trying to capture. We already based on previous meetings, centered around 5 impact areas, which is around climate mitigation, climate adaptation, biodiversity, forests, and rural livelihoods. And what we are going to do, and hopefully present by mid-November, are a number of key performance indicators, not 20 or 50, but 3 or 4 per impact area, that can help guide impact investors, development finance institutions, commercial banks, and institutional investors to not just look at it from a risk perspective, but also uniformly apply a number of selective KPIs that can basically demonstrate net positive impacts around climate, forest, biodiversity, and people. And basically, I think this kind of guidance is needed, especially also in light of the EU taxonomy on sustainable finance that will become law in 2022. Thanks.
Thank you. So I have other questions for the panel, but maybe we can take questions from the audience as well. So do you have... Oui, Pierre.
So my question is, do you think that there could be a way for a design of sustainable food commodity market, which would be effective and useful for the preservation of biodiversity? And that's a question for InVivo more than for the others, but I would be very interested in having your answers.
Thanks, Rachel.
Sure. So not an easy question, right? You'll admit, but of course that's what we're aiming for, is to try to see how we can have resilient agrosystems. So the way we're going about it is a value chain approach. That seems like a no-brainer, but actually things haven't necessarily always been conducted that way. And so if we start looking at it in terms of, with this value chain, who is bringing what, who is getting out what, where is the investment, the return on investment, and then linking it up so that actually when we have a better adequation between supply and demand, that's where already we can have a whole lot of savings. Because for example, if I take regenerative agriculture that I've been trying to talk about, which is only one part of the chain, the farmers who have done that, they've just gone out on a limb and done their own investments and have had their hard time making their ends meet and have been doing it just because they felt that that was what was right for them. On the other side, if we actually have an approach where it is multi-stakeholder, and we consider that, of course, regenerative agriculture is going to require not only a one single crop approach, which is how agriculture has been being done, but actually a more global system where the farmer is going to integrate many different types of crops within his or her crop rotation. And that from there, if we're sure that we have off-takers, each of whom are going to need that more sustainably developed foodstuff or material, then from there, actually, instead of the farmer taking everything all by him or herself, we actually have now a system that behooves a whole lot of actors. And so then that's the same logic as diversifying a portfolio, is that suddenly we have a better, more distributed investment approach from many, plus far greater security that actually the investments being made are actually going to meet their mark. And so from there, then of course, well, it's a no-brainer for financial services to come in because there they see that actually the business plan it holds water. So I really believe in the way of attacking the system as a multi-stakeholder approach. Of course, nobody likes that because everybody has already perfected their way of dealing with just one element. But nature doesn't work that way. And unfortunately, farming actually doesn't really either. It did for a couple of decades, but we already are now seeing the end of that model. So we have to step back and see, what are we trying to achieve? Why is this going to make sense for all of us on so many different ways? Because of the $1.14 trillion that the WEF signified this year as the financial opportunity of having regenerative agriculture. Or the 62 million jobs. I mean, hey, with the COVID, all of the jobs that we're stopping here, right? Interesting to think that this is the kind of dynamic that's going to require all of these new jobs. If we start taking it from that approach, then suddenly I think that the financial institutions can look at it in a different way. But we have to be smart about it and we have to keep the end goal in mind.
Gwen?
Maybe just to rebound off of what you said, because I totally agree in terms of the value chain approach, and I think this just highlights, going back to your question on market efficiency, the importance of pricing, the negative and the positive. So this goes all the way through, because if you're talking smallholder farmers, a lot of this is being funded on their own pocket right now, and it's really hard for them to get the credit that they need from any kind of commercial institution. Hence the importance of having this public-private partnership somehow, and the de-risking aspect that needs to go in, either through off-takes or a first loss guarantee, like I think Ivo had discussed earlier. So it just really goes to show that that's why it's so hard, I think, because you have so many players within the market, and as Rachel pointed out, you already have everybody siloed and perfected within their own process and systems, that you kind of need to still break this apart, ensure the right pricing, figure out, well, how do we even out the game so that at the end of the day, the people that actually need the most help are the ones that are getting it.
And hopefully that actually we've created more value at each of those posts. That's the magic of it, is to see how we can have an exponential approach, so that of course there has been this bits of value, and there's a war in terms of who gets what value about that, but there's actually an exponential there to see how the value is actually increased along the way.
Augustine or Ivo, do you want to add anything on this?
No, I mean, I'm not an agricultural specialist, but I definitely agree that we need a different way of producing agriculture. And also within UNED, there's a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture. I think if you look in the tropics, I mean, palm oil, soy, coffee, cocoa, etc., are all commodities that we use on a daily basis and that are currently driving deforestation and biodiversity loss. I can't say too much about whether and how to change those systems themselves, but what we are trying to do is to try and at least prevent further forest loss from happening. So basically decouple deforestation from commodity production. I think the example of the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility, where BNP Paribas finances the sustainable natural rubber plantation, obviously with its challenges, but where a smallholder program is integrated in a forest protection and reforestation program, with the key cash flow generating activity still being rubber. I think those are interesting examples, and what we basically try to scale up. But then the question is, do we need to produce this much soy for feedstock so that we can eat 45 kilos of meat every year? So I think ultimately we need to change the agricultural systems themselves. But I think as a stepping stone, we need to try to decouple the negative forest and biodiversity impacts from the commodities that are now being consumed by people around the world.
Thank you. Do we have other questions from the audience? Nothing virtually.
Sebastian, if I can just build on what was just being said.
Please go ahead.
Is that that's the magic to my eyes, is that, you know, talking about those specific commodities that you just mentioned, nature is actually a whole lot more productive than we want to believe. And we tend to talk about needing to produce less, but when it comes to looking at an actual ecosystem, what works is when everybody within that ecosystem is really thriving. And so palm oil has been done in a certain way. I mean, oil palms have been done in a monocropping certain kind of way. But I know about projects where it's actually going to be, there are companion crops that actually make sense with oil palm, and that actually can be used to help reforest degraded lands. It's not to say that I want to push greater consumption of palm oil, but it's just that we haven't necessarily been asking ourselves the questions that we're currently asking ourselves today. And these new questions that we're asking now are a great opportunity to reconsider just what actually nature can provide us. And so we all are quite aware of maybe of what the loss of nature signifies for our prosperity. But maybe what we can also consider is that actually working with nature can create a whole lot of additional solutions when we tend to try to just resolve the problems because of the way they've been done in the past, and not necessarily considering how actually there's a global approach that could really create new possibilities.
Thank you. So I have another question for the panel. So given the complexity of the preservation of biodiversity, we can see you have or said that it's important to work with the various stakeholders to finance it in an efficient way. So in your view, how can we create such fruitful partnerships? Have you got some examples of partnerships that work quite well? So yes, what are your views on this? Ivo, this time you can begin if you want.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So as a person, I'm always on the lookout to build new partnerships and collaborations. I think within the climate finance unit that we're leading, and at the start of the session, I indicated that we have a number of ambitious partnerships with impact investors such as Sil Ventures, Mirova, but also commercial banks like BNP Paribas, Rabobank, and others. What I would like to do in the months to come is to create a leaders group of investors, banks, governments, traders, and agribusinesses that are willing to make a significant, ambitious, and time-bound commitment to revise the decline of biodiversity, land degradation, and climate change. And to do that in the context of these massive events that were scheduled in this super year for nature 2020, but obviously because of COVID have been moved to 2021. with a clear ask and offer for each of the different stakeholders that are included. So I would say both for the panelists, the people tuning in and online and being present in Paris, if this does sound interesting, then I would be very interested to follow up with you. But I think the time of commitment without a clear ask and offer and without it addressing the urgency is that is past. We need something that is ambitious, that is time-bound, and that has a clear ask and offer with a plan that basically revises the decline of biodiversity and climate change in a much more significant way than what we've seen to date.
Thank you. Mathieu?
Yeah, I kind of think about a couple different ways the partnerships can take place. So I already mentioned the way we try to partner locally with our different biodiversity projects to sort of contextualize what we're doing. A lot of times that takes the form of partnering, especially in France, with local associations or different territories. I think in as much as it concerns indicators, which is something we've all talked about, we've had the chance to partner with a number of different organizations. So right now we're involved in a case study with CDC Biodiversity to look at their global biodiversity score and see where that might be applicable for us. So that's a place where we're actively engaging with players in the financial community to try and determine if we can figure out a corporate biodiversity indicator. That's also true for iCare and Consult's project biodiversity footprint as well. And then also, in terms of just studying our own impact, we've partnered, for example, with UNEP, with the World Conservation Monitoring Council, to look at 1,000 of our sites around the world and to try and get a sense of what's the actual ecological sensitivity of those sites, and then to report on those. So I think there's a variety of different ways you can partner both at the local level, which is really, to get back to your point, Rachel, about what are we really trying to do here and the importance of local context. A lot of cases, that takes place very much in the context of a tight local partnership. But at the corporate level too, I think, because a multi-stakeholder approach really is needed, we can address a lot of these questions around indicators, around how we're measuring, around comparability, like you mentioned, Gwen, in the context of these partnerships.
Rachel?
I guess, I mean, I've already made my case, so I agree with, with all of that. And maybe I can just mention one coalition that has recently been launched a year ago called One Planet Business for Biodiversity. And so there's 20 some odd companies currently invested in this coalition that were working really hard. We spent the first year working on definitions and trying to figure out exactly what we were talking about and what we were wanting to have as the resulting impact. And now we're currently working on designing programs to actually put it in place to be able to prove what these approaches actually can bring to all of us involved. So I think that these kinds of coalitions that have a real will to put things on the ground, correct them if need be, of course, because probably initial copies aren't always the final copies, but to really be striving to do that, but again, from this multi-stakeholder approach, I think that's a really fruitful way of moving forward.
Gwen?
So agree with what all my fellow panelists just said. I think I can I already talked about TNFD, obviously, and Rachel just mentioned OP2B. Maybe I boil it down into 5 words, right? Frameworks, data, facts, pricing, and scale. And the fact that we have the right partners around the table, because I think as everybody mentioned here, we don't have a lot of time to get this done. The stakes are high. Everybody's making commitments left and right. We get solicited as BNP Paribas for a task force here, a commitment there. But then we really need to be smart in terms of the use of our resources and time. And when we commit to something, we need to make sure that we're actually going to be able to implement it versus just this big high-level objectives that never get done and that people just talk about in conferences like this, but it just doesn't happen. And so that's the trust beyond this multi-stakeholder approach, I think, is what's key. Plus the relevance for having good pilots that actually go to fruition. Because we can have the best ambition and the best objectives in mind, but if we don't have something tangible that we can then show to investors or to banks or to people who are actual decision makers to say that this works, it's hard, but yes, it works, and yes, we can get it to scale, then it's never going to see the light of day.
Thank you. I have one question from the virtual audience. So do finance institutions develop circular economy and blue economy in order to help finance this positive impact on biodiversity? So circular economy and blue economy, it's a bit like biodiversity. It's quite complex for a financial institution, and especially because it's quite difficult to get relevant KPIs and metrics on this. Nonetheless, for BNP Paribas, but for other financial institutions as well, we're convinced that yes, we have to support the development of blue economy, we have to support circular economy. And I can give you two very simple examples. Our subsidiary BNP Paribas Asset Management has developed two ETFs, two funds. So last year it was a fund on circular economy, so investing in large companies that develop circular economy, and this year they launched another fund dedicated to blue economy. So yes, companies investing and supporting the development of blue economy. So clearly, financial institutions have to take care of this as well, and we are starting to do it. So I saw a question there.
Anne-Sixtine Angelbert from Observatoire de la RSE. I was wondering if you believe in corporate compensation actions, because I read somewhere that a field of planted trees does not compare with a real forest in terms of biodiversity. So what do you think of those like flagship actions, corporate actions? Thank you.
Rachel?
Je ne veux pas monopoliser, mais I think that it all just comes back down to the pertinence. That's the key. So there's been initiatives, there have been sort of some feel-good initiatives, and I do sometimes talk about it in maybe in the not nicest way, where there has been reforestation efforts that actually do more wrong than good. And today, we're aware of that. We weren't aware of it maybe for 10 good years. And the easy way around that is just, once again, considering the local and seeing where actually it makes sense and how it makes sense and what is it going to do, not only from an environmental perspective, but also a social perspective. That was also mentioned today, is that you have to consider what is that going to change to the people and the flora and the fauna that's there. Because, between not making the right choice of trees to putting trees and just presuming that that would take care of itself and forgetting that actually there's people on the ground that are going to need to manage those and that it's going, So if you take into consideration the people, the planet, and the profit, then usually that's going to help you be sure that you'll have a project that actually makes sense for the multi-stakeholders involved.
Just to build on that, I think, yes, the local context is really important, so local stakeholders are going to know really well what you need to do to sort of avoid some of these pitfalls. I think you can also benchmark there's plenty of standards that you can benchmark yourself to, and so when you're looking at a corporate that's involved in biodiversity, I think it's also important to take a look at their approach. Who are they partnered with? What are they benchmarking their projects to? Is there a certain minimum threshold they're trying to, something that's talked a lot about in sustainability, but what's sort of the minimum threshold of performance that they're trying to meet? I think there's a lot of ways to avoid that, because yeah, it is generally true that you can sometimes end up doing more harm than good. So I think there's kind of two articulations. There's one sort of at the local level, but then also more broadly, what sort of internationally recognized benchmarks are they pegging their projects to?
I heard mentioned earlier, I think it was Ivo, the landscape approach. And I think that's always a foolhardy way to do.
Ivo, do you want to add something on this? No,
I think that both Gwen and Matthew did a good job, so nothing to add from my side. Thanks.
So it's getting time, yes. So I think we can conclude on this. So I think we agree on quite a lot of things. We agree that we need actually a lot of things. We need to speed up incredibly fast to be online with the global targets of the preservation of biodiversity. We need more traceability. We need reliable data. And we need a diversity of data because, yes, biodiversity topics are very specific to local geographies, local contexts. So we need a diversity of data and of information to take care of the diversity of nature itself. So there is still much to be done, but apparently there are many actors that want to be active on this, and I hope that next year and the years after we'll have much more to tell and we'll have progress to show. So yes, see you in 1 year or before. Thank you.
Merci bien, Sébastien. Thanks everyone.